Yo, what's up guys? Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for the Dominaria United Alchemy set that's going to be released today on Arena. So this is a 30 card set that's going to be legal in both Alchemy and Historic. My main focus in this set review is going to be on Historic because that's the format out of the two that I'm just more interested in. So I'm going to go through all the cards in the set, talk about whether I think they could potentially see play in Historic. If I do think they have potential, talk about the homes that they're likely to go into, maybe some drawbacks to the card as well. And if I don't think the card is likely to see play in Historic, I am going to briefly go over what I think about it in Alchemy, but my main focus is going to be on Historic, because that's definitely the more interesting format out of the two in my opinion. So anyway, let's just get straight into it, starting off with the white cards here. We've got Benalish Knight-Counselor, which is a 1-mana 2/1 human knight with enlist, and whenever it enlists a creature, you get a boon with when you cast your next creature spell, that creature enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. So in terms of Historic, the biggest thing for this card is that it's a human. Obviously humans is a decent deck in Historic, and this is a pretty aggressively statted 1-drop. I think the biggest drawback with this card in Historic is that most of the best human decks are running Ranger Captain of Eos, and Ranger Captain of Eos kind of incentivizes you to be running 4 Esper Sentinel and then kind of a toolbox of 1-drops that you can tutor up with the Ranger Captain. And I don't think this really provides enough utility that you'd want to run it as part of that toolbox. So if you're running a Ranger Captain build, which I think is the best build of humans, this probably isn't going to see play. If you choose not to go with Ranger Captain and you just wanted to run a humans deck that's as low to the ground and as aggressive as possible, I could potentially see this seeing play because, you know, 1-mana 2/1 is decent aggressive stats, and the enlist ability allows you to attack past bigger blockers whilst growing the next creature you play. So if you did just want to run a humans deck that's as low to the ground as possible that wasn't running Ranger Captain, maybe you could play this, but I'm not really sure because, in my opinion, I think the Ranger Captain builds are the better builds, so this probably isn't going to see a cut in Historic, but it is a potential option that's worth bearing in mind. And in terms of Alchemy, I think if there's a white aggressive deck, this is definitely a great option there as well because it's just a really efficiently statted 1-drop. Next up, we've got Priest of Possibilities. This is a 2-mana 2/2 core cleric. When it enters the battlefield, look at the top 7 cards of your library. If a card among them has flying, Priest of Possibility gains flying, and then the same is true for First Strike, Double Strike, Death Touch, Haste, Hexproof, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, Protection, Reach, Trample, and Vigilance, and then Shuffle. So this is a really cool card. I really like the design on this. And in terms of Historic, there are 2 main homes that I could see it seeing play. Now, I think in general you don't want to play this in a deck that just happens to have, you know, other aggressive creatures with keywords. You know, even if you managed to get lucky and it was like a 2/2 with Flying, Death Touch, and Lifelink, I don't think that's really good in Historic. For this to be playable in Historic, I think you really need to be either getting Indestructible or Protection from a relevant type. Now, the way Protection works with this, you can't use it with something like a Serra's Emissary, unfortunately, because Serra's Emissary gains protection from the card type that you choose when it enters the battlefield, but you don't get the Enter the Battlefield trigger on this, so if you played this and you hit a Serra's Emissary, it would just gain protection from nothing, which is unfortunate. If this interaction worked, the card would be really, really good, but since it doesn't work with that, you know, protection is only really going to be relevant if you sideboard in something like an Archon of Absolution and then it hits that. So for the most part, I think in Historic, we're trying to give this Indestructible. If you can give this Indestructible, then it can potentially work as a decent roadblock against aggressive decks. And the 2 main ways that I think you could consistently set that up if you wanted to, first of all is in Reanimator, because Reanimator has a decent number of options for big creatures with a lot of keywords on them. So first of all, we've got Zatalpa Primal Dawn, which has Flying, Double Strike, Vigilance, Trample, and Indestructible, which if you can give all of those stats to a 2/2 for 2 mana, that's really, really strong. And secondly, you also have Avacyn Angel of Hope, which has Flying, Vigilance, and Indestructible. So you could potentially run a Reanimator deck with these 2 as your kind of 4-ofs to maximise your chances of the Priest of Possibility hitting it. But the issue with that is that you're kind of reducing the quality of your reanimation payoffs. So Reanimator as a deck in Historic is only really viable in Best of 1 because of Graveyard Hate, and I don't know if Zatalpa or Avacyn are really good enough to stabilise in Best of 1, especially against the go-wide aggressive decks, or even combo decks as well, because I think the best reanimation target in a vacuum is definitely Serra's Emissary, because if you're against a deck like Elves and they're going super wide, you can just put this into play naming creature and that just shuts the game out. If you're against a combo deck like Dragonstorm, same thing, you can just put it onto the battlefield naming creature and then they can't kill you with Terror of the Peaks, Bladewing Loop. Whereas Zatalpa and Avacyn, you know, if you're against an Elves deck and they're going really wide, I don't think an 8/8, just a single 8/8 with Indestructible is good enough to stop you from dying. So even though this is kind of a cute combo with these sorts of cards, I'm not sure whether Zetalpa and Avacyn are good enough reanimation targets for this to be worth it, really, if that makes sense. So I'm not 100% sure. If we end up getting something like Progenitus in the format, then it might be worth it, because Progenitus is really sick, and you would actually get protection from everything on the Priest of Possibility. But as things stand, I'm not sure this is really good enough to see play in Reanimator, and I don't think Reanimator is really going to break it in best of 3 either because of Graveyard Hate. The other potential option I could see to give this Indestructible consistently is off a deck running a lot of artifact lands, like Darksteel Citadel here, for example, because Priest of Possibility doesn't say creature, it says cards. So if you do have a high density of artifact lands with Indestructible, you know, there is Darksteel Citadel, there's also the dual lands that came out in the latest Historic Anthology, then you can pretty consistently give Priest of Possibility Indestructible, but this isn't a card that you want to be slotting into a deck like Affinity or the Thopter's deck, really. You'd want to be running it in a deck that is running a lot of the Indestructible lands. Maybe a deck that's trying to run Cleansing Wildfire, or I saw some deck recently running Fall of the Thran, or you could run like Trash for Treasure with Bolas's Citadel, for example. And then you could, pretty consistently give Priest of Possibility Indestructible as a really efficient blocker against aggro decks, but the issue there is that those decks aren't very good in general, so I'm not really sure it's worth it. But this is definitely a card that's worth bearing in mind going into future as more cards are released with extra keywords. Especially if stuff gets printed with protection. I think if you get protection from a relevant card type, like if there is a creature that is printed in later sets that has protection from creatures, then this card is definitely worth looking at again. But as things stand, I think it's going to be hard to make this work, but it's definitely a cool card. And next up we've got Pull of the Mistmoon. This is a 3-mana enchantment with Kicker for 1 and a blue. When it enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield, and if it's kicked, you give a non-land permanent card in your hand the same ability. So it's essentially an Oblivion Ring that if you kick it, turns another non-land card in your hand into an Oblivion Ring. This is definitely not going to see play in Historic, like a Banishing Light and stuff is runnable in Enchantress as a tutor target of Sterling Grove, but this is harder to cast, and the only real benefit you have is that it has Kicker, and typically Enchantress decks aren't in blue, so I don't see it seeing play there. Even in Alchemy, Oblivion Ring effects aren't really run, so I generally don't think this is going to see play in either format, but it's an interesting effect for sure. Next up we've got Oracle of the Alpha. So this is a really cool design. So this is a 3-mana 2/3 with flying, and when it enters the battlefield you conjure the power 9 into your library, then shuffle, and whenever it attacks you scry 1. So the power 9, if you're not aware, hold on, let me just get the spellbook up here. So it's Ancestral Recall, which is 1 mana instant, draw 3. Time Walk, which is 2 mana sorcery, take an extra turn after this one. Time Twister, 3 mana sorcery, each player shuffles their hand into their graveyard. Each player shuffles his or her hand and graveyard into their library, then draws 7. And then the rest are Black Lotus, and then each Mox. So this is obviously a really cool card because these are just the most generically powerful cards in Vintage in general. The issue with this card is that you are putting 2 really good cards into the deck. Obviously Ancestral Recall and Time Walk are absolutely insane. Time Twister is a very powerful card, but is kind of contextual whether it's good or not. And then the rest of the cards, the Black Lotus and all the Moxen, they're cards that are very good if you have them in your opening hand, but shuffling them into your deck is generally going to be a drawback because as the game goes on, they're essentially just going to be lands. A lot of them are going to be off colour, so you're not even going to be able to use the mana you get off it. So for this to be good, or for this to work, you either need to be running a deck that actively wants the Moxes in your deck. So for example, if you're running something like Song of Creation, you might want to have them in your deck because they're just 0 mana spells that draw you cards. If you're running ways to play off the top of your deck like Reality Chip, you could potentially take advantage of it as well because they're just free spells at that point. But the issue with these cards is Song of Creation I don't think is really that good of a deck. Your whole deck is built around the Song of Creation, and I have seen some people having like okay success with it, but for the most part I don't think this deck is particularly good. Options to play off the top of your library, Reality Chip is a good one for sure, so you could potentially run a mono blue or a blue X artifact synergy deck, maybe with Psy. I put a mono blue affinity deck out a little while ago that was running Psy, Reality Chip and Emery, and Reality Chip with the Moxen is a nice combo as well, but I don't think it's really that good, to be honest. Reality Chip is vulnerable to interaction. There are other options to play off the top of your library like Experimental Frenzy, but at that point the Ancestral Recall isn't even that good to hit off Experimental Frenzy because you can't use the cards that you draw into your hands. So I think most ways you have of playing off the top of the library don't really work super well with the Oracle of the Alpha. The other main way that you could abuse it is if you have consistent ways to tutor up the Ancestral Recall and the Time Walk. In both Alchemy and Historic we have Micromancer, which can tutor up Ancestral Recall, which is nice. I think this is definitely too slow for Historic, but this could be worth looking into in Alchemy if you ran Oracle of the Alpha, Micromancer to get the Ancestral Recall. But again, you're essentially putting 6 dead cards into your deck, so it doesn't really feel worth it to do that. In Historic, it is worth noting that you can go infinite with Time Walk with Cyber Siphoner and Ephemerate. So if you have a way to efficiently tutor up the Time Walk, you can potentially set up infinite turns, which is, again, I have my doubts. That seems like going through so many steps to set this up, but it's definitely worth noting. I think the most efficient way to tutor up Time Walk is with Solve the Equation, but the biggest issue with this card and trying to do broken things with it is you're having to run these cards that are otherwise bad. So if you end up in situations where you don't have the Oracle of the Alpha and you have Solve the Equation, you need to have stuff in your deck that you would want to tutor up with the Solve the Equation, even if you didn't have the Oracle of the Alpha. And then you would also need a way to loop the Time Warp or whatever you're searching up. So I think it's something I'm going to try out, but I really don't think this is going to be that good in Historic, to be honest, just because it's so convoluted setting up the steps. The format is so fast. If there was a deck that was already running Solve the Equation to get something else, or there was a deck that was already running Reality Chip, or Song of Creation was already a good deck, then I could see this seeing play. But my gut instinct is that this is a really cool card, but I think you just have to jump through too many hoops to get it to work, really. And next up we've got Skywriter Djinn, 4 mana 3/4 with flying. It has Domain. When it enters the battlefield, conjure a random card from its spellbook into your hand. Then if you have fewer cards in hand than the number of basic land types among lands you control, repeat this process. So if we go to the spellbook, I mean, this is definitely not a card that's going to see any play in Historic. In terms of Alchemy, I'm still not really sure about this card. Like, all the cards in the spellbook are okay at best, really. You can blink it with Teferi's Time Twist to do it again, but all of these cards are pretty mediocre, and the main reason that you would want to be running Domain in Alchemy, in my opinion, is to be running stuff like Sphinx of Clear Skies, and if I was going to be running Domain in Alchemy, I would be running Leyline Binding with Fragment Reality to cheat Sphinx of Clear Skies into play, and that would require you to not be running any other creatures other than the Sphinx of Clear Skies. So maybe I'm missing something with this card, but it just doesn't seem powerful enough to even see play in Alchemy to me, personally. Next up we've got Trove Mage, which is a 3 mana human wizard. It's a 2/2, and when it enters the battlefield, seek an artifact card from the top 10 cards of your library, then shuffle. So this is a cool card. I don't think it's going to see any Historic play. You could run this in an artifact deck, but there's just no room for this in Affinity. It's just too slow. It's just like a worse Ingenious Smith. I mean, obviously this looks a lot more cards deep, but because it's specifically in the top 10 cards, you can't use this as a tutor. If it just said seek an artifact card through your whole deck, then I'd be much more interested in this, because you could just run one really powerful artifact to tutor up. If you're running like a Bolas's Citadel deck or a Paradox Engine, for example, then this is much more appealing. But because it looks at only the top 10, you can't use it as a specific tutor, and just as a value card, it's just too slow for Historic. In terms of Alchemy, I'm not really sure there's a really powerful enough, well, there's not really an artifact deck in Alchemy, but if more artifacts get added, like I'm sure they will in Brothers War and the Brothers War Alchemy set, this is a card I could see seeing play after those sets releases. But as it stands for now, I think it's just too slow for Historic, can't be used to tutor specific artifacts, and doesn't really have good enough artifacts to be played in Alchemy, but definitely one to bear in mind when the Brothers War comes out for sure. Next up we've got Vesuvan Mist, 2 mana instant with Kicker for 1 in the black. Return target non-token, non-land permanent to its owner's hand. If the spell was kicked, you conjure a duplicate of that card into your hand, and you can pay mana of... you may spend mana as though it were mana of any colour to cast this spell. So this is essentially the front side of Brazen Borrower, except you can't hit tokens, which is... that is a substantial drawback. A lot of the best Brazen Borrower bounces you'll get is when you're bouncing something like a Shark Typhoon token or some other token, so that is definitely a drawback. So I mean, Brazen Borrower already isn't a great card in Historic, so this is definitely not going to see play in Historic. In Alchemy, I mean, if you're playing a tempo deck, you might want this, but the kicker ability kind of incentivizes you to be playing more of a grindy value deck, because you get to then cast a copy of whatever you bounce. So I don't know, I'm not really sure this is going to see play in either format really. There isn't really a great tempo deck in Alchemy as far as I'm aware, so this just seems like a card that's cool but doesn't really fit into any deck in Alchemy, and is definitely not powerful enough for Historic. Next up we've got Darigaaz's Whelp, which is a 2-mana 2/1 dragon with kicker, 1 in a red and flying, and whenever you draw a dragon card it perpetually gains +1/+1. When it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, you seek a dragon card, and both the Whelp and the dragon that you seek gets perpetually +1/+1 as well. So again, this isn't a Historic playable card. Dragons isn't a deck in Historic, and even if it was, I think this would just be too low power level really. In Alchemy, Dragons has been a deck in the past, and it is getting one, like, I think the most generically powerful card in the set that we'll get to a bit later is a Jund Dragon, so I definitely think this could see play in Alchemy if there's a good Jund Dragon deck. You know, I've been quite interested in building dragons with Cabaretti Revels. Obviously the mana is a bit rough now that Revels cost red, green, but I'm definitely going to be trying this out in a Dragons deck in Alchemy. I definitely think it could see play there. But yeah, no chance this is going to see play in Historic, unfortunately. Next up we've got Diminished Returner. So this is a 3-mana 4/3, enters the battlefield tapped, and you can play black and return it from your graveyard to the battlefield. It perpetually gains -1/-1, and you can only do this if its toughness is 2 or greater. So this, again, not powerful enough for Historic, even though you can bring it back from the graveyard. In Alchemy, I think it could see play maybe if you're playing like a mono black aggressive deck. You can only bring it back from the graveyard twice, but if you have ways to perpetually give it +1/+1, you can bring it back more often. Again, I don't know, like maybe it's playable in mono black aggro, but definitely not going to see play in Historic, and it's not the most exciting 3-drop in black. You do have a lot of good options in black at the 3-drop slot. You know, Graveyard Trespasser is definitely a card that I would be running ahead of this, but if you want to run a value black deck, or maybe a deck that wants to have a lot of sacrifice fodder that you can bring back from the graveyard, I could potentially see this seeing play. So if it is going to see play, it will probably be in mono black in Alchemy, but outside of that, not super interested in this one. Next up we've got Reezug the Bonecobbler, and this is a really interesting one. So this is a 2-mana legendary creature. It's a 1/3, and you can tap it, and target creature in your graveyard perpetually becomes an artifact. You may cast it this turn, and it loses all other card types. So how this works is it essentially turns one of your creatures into an artifact, and it is no longer a creature. So the main reasons you would be interested in using this card is if a creature is very frail but has a good ability. Bringing this back as an artifact means that it can't be killed by creature removal, which is really important. And additionally, since it's not a creature, it can use tap abilities immediately. So the two main reasons that you would want to use this card is if you have a creature that's frail with a good ability, or you have a creature with a tap ability, because it basically doesn't have summoning sickness because it's an artifact. So in terms of Historic, I feel like there could potentially be a combo that I haven't figured out with this card, but the main homes that I'm excited for this in that come to mind straight away are Kethis combo and Paradox Engine, because in Kethis combo you can use this to reanimate all of your combo pieces like Kethis, Diligent Excavator, Kinnan and stuff like that as well. And Emery as well is really important, because Emery has a really, really powerful tap ability. The biggest issue with Emery is it's very frail, and if the opponent kills it before you get to untap, you don't get to use it. But Reezug being able to bring back Emery as an artifact means that it can't be killed unless the opponent has artifact removal, and you can activate its effect immediately because it's not a creature, so it doesn't have summoning sickness. So this could potentially see play in Kethis combo as either an alternative to Lazav. I think they both do similar things, or maybe if you wanted to run additional copies of that sort of effect, it could be good. Because you can, like I said, you can reanimate Kethis, which then can't be killed by creature removal. You could reanimate Diligent Excavator, which can't be killed by creature removal as well. So it could be good there. It could also be good in Paradox Engine, because again, it works really well with Emery there. Kinnan is another card that has a really, really powerful ability, but is a very frail creature. So being able to bring that back seems really nice. And the this obviously has a tap ability itself, so if you have got Paradox Engine going, you can tap it to bring back a creature like a Llanowar Elves as a mana rock, and then when Paradox Engine triggers, it untaps this again, so you can then bring back another creature. So if you have a creature that can either sacrifice itself or costs 0 mana like a Stonecoil Serpent, you can use that to trigger Paradox Engine infinitely as well. So the two main homes that come to mind, like I said, are either Kethis or Sultai Paradox Engine, which are both decks that I'm going to be trying. Again, I definitely feel like there could be a combo with this card that I'm completely missing, so let me know in the comments if there's something cool that you've come up with, because this card definitely seems like it has a lot of potential, and I could actually see this seeing play in certain historic decks. Next up, we have Smogbelcher Chariot, which is a 3-mana vehicle with Menace, Death Touch, and Lifelink. And whenever it attacks, target creature that crewed it this turn perpetually gains your choice of Menace, Death Touch, or Lifelink, and it has crew 3. So, at first glance, this isn't a card that I was particularly interested in historic, but the main thing that did potentially draw me to this card is the ability to give one of your creatures Death Touch perpetually. And that is because if you give a creature that can deal damage to other creatures Death Touch, it will kill the other creature immediately. So this kind of works similarly to how Call of the Death Dweller worked with goblins like Goblin Chainwhirler, because if you give a creature like Pashlik Mons Death Touch perpetually, whenever any of your goblins dies, you can use Pashlik Mons to deal 1 damage to an opposing creature, and because Pashlik Mons has Death Touch, it will immediately kill that creature. So if you have an effect like a Pashlik Mons or a Mayhem Devil, this is a really nice way to give it Death Touch. So if you wanted to build a deck that was focused around some stuff like Call of the Death Dweller with like Fanatical Firebrand or Munitions Expert or Goblin Chainwhirler, the fact it gives it perpetual Death Touch is really nice, because if you have ways to recur goblins from the graveyard, or if you're playing Mayhem Devil, a way to recur that is a potential way that you can just completely destroy other creature decks. Now, having said that, you do have to jump through quite a lot of hoops to do that, and those sorts of decks are very focused on beating creature decks and are probably going to have a hard time against control, so I'm not really sure that's going to be worth doing in historic. In terms of Alchemy, I think this is just a generically powerful card. I'll have to double check if there are any creatures in Alchemy that are playable that can ping down other creatures. If there are, then this seems like it could be good there, but in Alchemy the format is just a lot lower power level, so just giving stuff Menace, Death Touch, or Lifelink for value seems decent there as well. But this could potentially see play in historic if you're running a creature that can ping down other creatures, but for the most part I'm not really sure it's worth building around, but definitely an interesting card for sure. Next up, we've got Ghitu Embercoiler. So this is one of the cards that I'm the most excited for. So this is a 2-mana 2/2 with prowess, and at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase you may discard a card. If you do, seek a card with greater mana value and exile it. Until the end of your next turn you may play the exiled card. So the first thing to note with this card is that it says pre-combat main phase, which means it doesn't trigger the turn you play it, unfortunately. When I first read it, I thought it triggered the turn you played it, which would be really strong. So it's kind of like Black Market Connections. You play it, and you have to wait until next turn to get the ability off. So the first deck that sprung to mind that this could be a good home for is Madness, maybe Mono Red Madness or Red splashing another colour, because I think the biggest issue, or one of the biggest issues with that deck, is you don't have great ways to discard stuff. You know, you've got Faithless Looting, Fable of the Mirror Breaker, and Seasoned Pyromancer, which are all really good. I always felt like the deck needed another discard outlet, and this definitely seems like the best one, because previously decks were running Magmatic Channeler, which is a very similar card. You know, you have to wait a turn to activate it, and you discard a card and get value off it. But the thing I like about this is it has, first of all, it has prowess, so if you're running a lot of interaction or a lot of burn spells, this can be used as an aggressive creature, but the fact that it seeks a card with greater mana value gives you the opportunity to guaranteed tutor a card. So say you were running this in a Mono Red Madness deck, typically that curve kind of ends at 3 with the must play threats. You know, you probably want to be playing Seasoned Pyromancer, you probably want to be playing Fable of the Mirror Breaker, which means that if you have Ghitu Embercoiler and you discard a 3-drop, you can essentially tutor whatever, you know, you could just play one card which costs more than 3 mana and guaranteed tutor that every single time. So, for example, in the main deck, you could be main decking Hollow One, for example, which, so, you know, you discard a 3-drop, which could be like a Fiery Temper or something to get value off that. Then you guaranteed tutor a Hollow One, and then if you play like another way to discard, you can cast a Hollow One for free, or you could play like an Embercleave or a Torbran. The really exciting thing with this card, though, is post-sideboard, it's a guaranteed way for you to find your silver bullet cards. So say for example you want to run Shatterstorm against the Affinity or the Thopter's deck. If you're running, if your curve ends at the 3-drop slot and you board out your Hollow One and board in Shatterstorm, this could be a way for you to guaranteed shooter up your sideboard card. You know, if you're against Control, you could board in like the 6-mana Chandra or something. If you're against, you know, a Go Wide Elves deck, you could tutor up a 4-mana Sweeper. So the ability for this to just produce value is really nice, but the ability to be able to tutor up specific cards if your curve ends at a specific point is really appealing to me. Again, I'm not 100% sure what the best card to tutor up would be. Like, the first ones that come to mind, like I said, are Hollow One, Embercleave, and Torbrand. But if you've got any good ideas for cards that you could potentially tutor up with this, definitely let me know in the comments, because this is one that I'm going to be brewing with pretty soon after this set comes out. Next up, we've got Goblin Influx Array, which is a 4-mana enchantment. Goblin spells you cast cost red less to cast, or if it doesn't require red, it costs 1 colourless less to cast. And at the beginning of your end step, conjure a random card from its spellbook into your hand. So we'll just have a quick look at the spellbook here. So we've got War Chief, Chieftain, Prospector, Brash Taunter, Wily Goblin, Trashmaster. So we've got some, you know, it's a decent mix. There are some really powerful ones in here and some slightly less powerful ones, but they're all going to be relevant if you're playing a Goblins deck. So in terms of Historic, I've been thinking a lot about this card recently. I think if you were going to run this in Historic, you would obviously want to be running it alongside Muxus, because this enables you to cast Muxus a turn sooner, which is pretty huge. But the issue with this is, in the Goblins deck, I don't think you can really afford to be running more than 4 non-Goblin spells or 4 non-creature spells in the deck, or your Muxus hits start to get really bad. So if you were going to run this in the deck, I think you would need to run it in place of Fable of the Mirror Breaker. And being 4 mana as opposed to 3 is a pretty big drawback, I think. If you were going to run this in Historic Goblins, I think you would want to maximise ramp as much as possible, because you really want to be able to cast this on turn 3 as often as possible. So obviously you'd be running 4 Scout Prospector, but if I was going to build a Historic Goblins deck with this in, I would also want to be running 4 Wily Goblin and potentially 4 Goblin and Archamancer, which is the red-green Goblin that makes your red and green spells cost 1 less to cast, because casting this on turn 4 when it doesn't do anything the turn it comes down, you know, at least Fable of the Mirror Breaker produces a 2/2 straight away, which has an impact on the board. So this feels, I mean, I could potentially see it seeing play in the sideboard. I think it does a similar thing to Herald's Horn, but guarantees a hit every single turn. I think the big issue with Herald's Horn right now is that it gets killed by Divine Purge, which is a really big drawback. This dodges Divine Purge. Enchantments are a lot more difficult to interact with in Historic, so I don't know. I'm going to be trying this card out for sure in Historic. I do have my reservations because it's 4 mana and it doesn't impact the board immediately, but if you're running a build that is very focused on ramping with Wily Goblin, Goblin and Archamancer, this could be a good option. In terms of Alchemy, I'm potentially more excited for this card in Alchemy. I mean, it is generically powerful, so it's going to be a lot more powerful in a lower power format. And I think there are good enough goblins for it to work. I think you could potentially run this alongside Cabaret Revels as well in Alchemy, which seems really strong. So I'm definitely going to be trying this in Historic and Alchemy. Historic, I don't know, like, I feel like it could be good, but it also seems quite slow. You know, Fable of the Mirror Breaker at 3 mana sometimes even feels a bit slow in certain matchups, and that has impact the turn you play it on the board as well. So this could be too slow. It could be a sideboard card, but either way, I'm definitely going to be trying it because it does seem really strong in the long game. The other thing that I'm a bit reluctant about with this card is that Goblins is already a deck that is very good at grinding, and its main weakness is to the very, very fast aggressive decks. So if you are going to play this in a similar kind of Goblin shell as exists at the moment, in place of Fable of the Mirror Breaker, it does just seem like it's just making the deck better in ways it's already good and slower in general, which doesn't help the bad matchups. But I don't know, I'm going to be trying out a few different ideas with this, and I definitely think this is going to see play in Alchemy either way. Next up we've got Goblin Morale Sergeant, 2 mana 2/1 with haste and enlist, and whenever it enlists a non-token creature, you may conjure a duplicate of that creature into top 5 cards of your library at random, and it perpetually gains +0/+0 and gains haste. So this isn't going to see play in Historic. There are so many better options for Goblins at the 2-drop slot. You got Snoop, Battlecry Goblin, Runvelt Hordemaster, Wily Goblin, Munitions Expert. So there's too many better options for Historic. In terms of Alchemy though, you know, like I said, I'm excited to try this out in Alchemy because I think it's a really generically powerful card, and so I think this is definitely going to be a Goblin that you play in Alchemy, because, you know, it having haste is nice. There are a number of Goblins that you will want to be able to get another copy of. You know, something like a Runveld Hordemaster, a Goblin Trashmaster. If you get a good hit off the Goblin Influx array, being able to get another copy of it as well off the Morale Sergeant seems good. So probably going to see playing Alchemy Goblins if that's the deck. Definitely not powerful enough for Historic. Next up we've got Spellchain Scatter. 1 mana instant. When you cast your next instant or sorcery this turn, conjure a duplicate of that spell into your hand. If this spell wasn't kicked, discard the duplicate at the beginning of your next end step. So definitely not powerful enough for Historic. And in terms of Alchemy, I'm not really sure where you're going to be running this. There aren't that many good instants and sorceries that you would want to get a second one of. You know, Expressive Iterations Rotated, which was the most powerful instant or sorcery in the format previously. So unless I'm missing something, I don't really think this is going to see play in Alchemy either. Then onto the green cards. We've got Marwyn's Kindred, which is X2 and double green. Conjure a card named Marwyn the Nurturer and X cards named Land of Werewolves onto the battlefield. So this is a cool, flavorful card, but I just don't understand this, like, because it's a ramp payoff, but the payoff is more ramp. Like, Marwyn the Nurturer is a 3 mana 1/1 that taps for green for the amount of power it has and gains +1/+1 for each elf that enters the battlefield. So the idea with this is you get a lot of mana, play this, you get a Marwyn and loads of Llanowar Elves, and you just have access to a ton of mana. But if you're ramping into something, you want the payoff to be good in its own right. You don't want the payoff to produce extra mana, really. So not going to see play in Historic, and I don't see this seeing play in Alchemy. You know, if you're going to play a ramp deck, you should be probably trying to ramp into like a Titan of Industry or something rather than this. So I don't really understand this card. Like, it's cool, flavorful, but I just don't see it seeing play anywhere, really. Next up we've got Nantuko Slicer, 4 mana 3/2 with Kicker for black, and when it enters the battlefield, return target card from your graveyard to your hand. If the spell was kicked, conjure a duplicate of target card in an opponent's graveyard, and you get a copy into your hand that you can cast with any mana. So this is, I very much doubt this is going to see play in Historic, because it's kind of similar to Timeless Witness, which is basically a card that doesn't see any play, and I don't think the kicker on this is going to really make much of a difference. In terms of Alchemy, I think this is potentially a good effect if you're running a mid-range deck. You know, if you're choosing to run a Djinn mid-range deck, I could definitely see this seeing play. You know, getting back the best card from your graveyard and then getting a card from your opponent's graveyard seems very good. The format is still very grindy, very mid-range based, so I think this is potentially going to see play in Alchemy in like maybe a Djinn mid-range shell. Definitely not powerful enough for Historic in my opinion though. Next up we've got a Vinesoul Spider, 2 mana 3/2 with Reach, and at the beginning of your end step, put a random land card from your library into your graveyard. So I really like this effect. I think the effect is cool. I don't think it really does anything in Historic. You know, there's Soul of Windgrace that some Djinn lists are running, but I don't think that's really good enough for Historic. If there was some cool combo with, you know, having lands in your graveyard, this would be a cool enabler, but as far as I'm aware, there isn't anything like that in Historic. In terms of Alchemy, Soul of Windgrace is still legal in Alchemy. So, you know, if you're running a Soul of Windgrace deck, this could be a cool enabler for that. I've not had a ton of, you know, I've not scoured Scryfall for cards that this works well with in Alchemy, but, you know, 2 mana 3/2 with Reach is fine stats, and if you have payoffs for putting lands in your graveyard, like Soul of Windgrace or other payoffs, then this seems like a playable card in Alchemy if you can abuse the synergies, but definitely not good enough for Historic. Next up we've got Wandering Treefolk, 2 mana 2/3 with Vigilance. It has Domain for 8 mana, seek a creature card, and the ability costs 1 less to activate for each basic land type among lands you control. So definitely not going to see play in Historic. You know, it's just way too slow. So if you have Domain at maximum, so all 5 land types, this costs 3 to seek a creature card, which is fine. You know, in Alchemy I think that's a decent rate, but the problem, same with the Djinn that I was talking about earlier, I think the biggest problem with this card is that if I was going to play Domain in Alchemy, I would be playing more of a control deck using Fragment Reality with Leyline Binding to cheat Sphinx of Clear Skies into play. So I'm not really sure this would see play because it interrupts that combo, if that makes sense. But, you know, if Domain decks become more value-based and more mid-rangey without being a control deck, this could potentially see play in Alchemy because, you know, paying 3 to get a creature is a good rate if you can set that up. But, again, as things stand, if I'm playing Domain in Alchemy, I'm probably not going to be running any creatures other than Sphinx of Clear Skies. Then onto the multicoloured cards, starting off with Arvad Weatherlight Smuggler. 2 mana Vampire Knight. It's a legendary creature with Death Touch and Lifelink. It's a 1/1, and at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, it perpetually gains +X/+X, where X is the number of creatures that died this turn, and this ability also triggers if it's in your graveyard. So this is a cool card. I really like the design on this. The fact it gets additional power and toughness in the graveyard is really nice. In terms of historic play, if there was a deck that is very good at recurring cheap creatures from your graveyard, this would be really nice, because, you know, a really big creature with Death Touch and Lifelink, you know, a 2 mana 1 with Death Touch Lifelink is good at stopping the opponent from attacking in. It's going to grow over the course of the game if you're playing Sacrifice synergy. So if there was a way, or a deck that is good at recurring creatures from the graveyard, this could maybe see play, but as things stand, a deck like that doesn't really exist at the moment. In terms of Alchemy, though, I think this could see play, because I've seen some white-black sacrifice decks, I've seen some Mardu sacrifice decks, and if you had ways, you know, say you're playing Mardu Anvil and you have Blood Fountain to get this back from the graveyard, or if there was more of a reanimation sub-theme, you know, you're playing Can't Stay Away, then this is potentially a really powerful card, because the Anvil mirrors are all about the life point race, so having this as an early roadblock that then grows over the course of the game if both players are sacrificing their Anvil stuff. If you have a way to get this back from the graveyard consistently, I could see it seeing play there. So definitely an interesting card for Alchemy, and if there was a historic deck that can consistently bring back cheap creatures from the graveyard, this maybe could see play, but as things stand, probably not going to see play in historic. Then we've got Bloodsprout Talisman, 2 mana artifact, enters the battlefield tapped, and you can tap it and pay 1, choose an online card in your hand, it perpetually gains this spell cost 1 less to cast. So this is always going to be a spooky card because of the Alchemy decks that have recently, you know, the combo decks that have recently kind of broken the format in the Trapfinder and the Grinning Ignis decks, so I'm kind of surprised to see them printing more perpetual cost reduction. I've tried to build perpetual decks in Alchemy since then. Ominous Traveller without Burgi or without the repeated treasures from Racketeer Boss doesn't really seem breakable at the moment. I did try, and maybe I'm missing something. Like, you can pretty consistently reduce the cost of Ominous Traveller to 0. You know, I've recently been playing an Anvil deck where Trapfinder and Ominous Traveller are the only 2 actual creatures in the deck, so it's pretty easy to sack the Trapfinder, get Ominous Traveller for 0, but just playing Traveller for 0 mana, you know, it doesn't go infinite, so there's not really that much incentive to be playing that as opposed to just a full regular Anvil deck. So I don't know, I feel like this, if there's a way to go infinite with Ominous Traveller that I'm not aware of, or gets printed later, then this could potentially see play as kind of redundancy to reduce the cost of it. But as things stand, I think this is probably just going to be like a bad Mind Stone. In Historic, Grinning Ignis is still playable as a deck, but I don't think it's a particularly good deck, and the fact that this enters tapped isn't great. The fact you have to be enjunned in that deck to make this work doesn't seem great either. I think if I was going to run Grinning Ignis in Historic, again, I would probably be running 4 Trapfinder, 4 Burgi, 4 Ominous Traveller as my only creatures in the deck, and try and go via the Trapfinder route instead. But I tried that deck, and it's not really that good anymore, considering the opponent has a lot of interaction points now because you're reliant on Burgi. You can no longer go infinite with Racketeer Boss, which was the biggest draw to playing that deck, because the opponent didn't really have good ways to interact with you because they just didn't have a point of interaction, right? If you had the treasures and the Grinning Ignis returns to your hand as part of the cost to pay the card, there was no point of interaction, whereas now you're reliant on Burgi, which is a lot more interactable, if that makes sense. So I'm not sure this is going to see play, but, you know, this kind of effect is always going to be spooky, as we've seen with Trapfinder and Ignis. Next up, we've got Darigaaz, Shivan Champion, which is a 5 mana 5/5 dragon with flying, legendary creature. At the beginning of your end step, conjure a random card from its spellbook into exile face down with 3 egg counters on it, and it gains at the beginning of your upkeep. If this card is exiled, remove an egg counter from it and then put it onto the battlefield. So this is probably the most generically powerful card in the whole set, because all of these cards that it has in the spellbook are all definitely powerful dragons. In terms of historic play, the power level is definitely there. Like, it is a powerful card, but I'm not sure what deck would play it. You know, if you're playing Jund mid-range, I don't think you can really afford to play 5 mana threats. If you can, I think there are potentially better options. You've got Minsk and Boo. The fact that this doesn't impact the board that much the turn it comes down means that I think you'd probably want to be running something like a Glory Bringer over this as well. It is a very generically powerful card because, you know, as long as it survives to the end step, you're guaranteed to get a dragon in 3 turns, and then if it survives and the opponent can't kill it, it's just going to completely run away with the game. So I think in terms of raw power level, it's definitely playable in Historic, but I'm not sure it's worth it in any of the current decks. You know, like I said, if I wanted to run a 5 mana threat in Jund mid-range or Rakdos mid-range or whatever, I would probably go with something like Minsk and Boo or Glory Bringer instead, but, you know, maybe this could see play. I'm sure people are going to try it. In terms of Alchemy, though, this card is going to be huge. I'm sure this card is going to be, you know, birthing a lot of Jund mid-range decks as a really, really powerful top-end card that's going to run away with the game. I'm definitely going to be trying this in Alchemy. It seems like an incredibly powerful card in that format for sure. Next up, we've got Juggernaut Peddler, 2 mana 2/2 with Vigilance. When into the battlefield, target player reveals all non-land cards in their hand. You may choose one of those cards. If you do, that player exiles it and conjures a card named Juggernaut into their hand. So, if you don't know what Juggernaut is, it's this 4 mana artifact creature that's a 5/3, attacks each combat if possible, and can't be blocked by walls. So, this is a really interesting card because a lot of the time I've really wanted kind of the elite spellbinder effect on a cheaper body. Now we have the ability to exile the opponent's most problematic card at on a 2 mana creature, which is like, it's definitely interesting. The big drawback though is that Juggernaut is definitely a card that is going to affect the battlefield if you're playing an aggressive deck. So for the most part, when you want this sort of effect is when you're playing an aggro deck and you want to play this sort of effect to get rid of the opponent's sweeper. Now the fact that the Juggernaut does have to attack means that, you know, if the opponent does play the Juggernaut, you can just wait for it to attack and then attack on the following turn to keep pressuring damage. And if you are playing this against a control deck, if they're tapping out to play a Juggernaut, that means that they have shields down for the turn. They don't have any counter spells or anything. So in Historic, I could potentially see this seeing play in the sideboard of aggressive decks like Humans. You know, it is a human itself, because I have always wanted that elite spellbinder effect at the 2 mana slot because it gets underneath Archmage's Charm and stuff like that. But the fact you're giving the opponent something that is going to meaningfully affect the battlefield is a drawback. I'm definitely going to be trying it in the sideboard though. I don't think you can really afford to main deck this, but this could potentially see play in the sideboard of Historic aggressive decks. Next up, we've got Niambi, Beloved Protector, 2 mana 2/2 with Flash, and when it enters the battlefield, choose target non-legendary creature in your graveyard that was put there from the battlefield this turn. Return it to the battlefield. It perpetually gains. Whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability, draw a card. This ability triggers once each turn. So this is basically a way to bring back creatures that your opponent have used removal on. I definitely think the power level is there for this to see play in Historic, but I'm just not sure what deck it slots into, really. You know, the decks that really want to protect its creatures the most are Auras, and I don't think you're going to be running this in Auras. You'd much rather run more 2 mana threats like Stormchaser Drake or Light Paws or something like that. It is a human, so you could potentially use this kind of similar to how Extraction Specialist is used. You know, if a control deck kills your Thalia, you could flash this in and bring it back, and then when they try and target it, you get to draw cards. So this could potentially see play in the sideboard of Humans against interactive decks like Rakdos or Control, potentially. In terms of Alchemy, I could see this seeing play, you know, similarly in sideboards of Esper, maybe, against very interactive decks. You know, if the opponent uses a removal spell on a Diviner Fates, you can flash this in, get Diviner Fates back, and then they get to draw a card whenever it's targeted. So this is definitely a really powerful effect, and I could potentially see it play in Historic, mainly in the sideboard though. I don't think you'd really want to run it in the main deck. Next up, we've got Protean War Engine. So this is a 2 mana vehicle. As it enters the battlefield, draft a card from its spellbook and exile it. And whenever it's crewed, until the end of turn, it becomes a copy of the exiled card. So we'll have a look at the spellbook here. Where is it? So you've got, like, I think the biggest issue with this card is the quality of the cards really varies. You've got some really great hits and some not so great hits, and you only get to pick it once. Unless you have a way to blink it, you're stuck with whichever creature it is. So I'm not sure this is really good enough for Historic, to be honest. Like, the fact it's 2 mana and can potentially turn into like a 5 mana creature when you crew it is pretty nice, but I don't think there's any deck in Historic that can really enable this. In Alchemy, you know, I think, you know, the value of playing a 2-mana card like this and potentially hitting like a Serra Paragon or like a Resplendent Angel or a really powerful creature could potentially mean it sees play. You know, crew 3 is quite a lot, but there are also cards in the format if you wanted to build a vehicles deck that can crew, you know, there are 1-drops that can crew bigger vehicles, for example. So if there's a vehicles deck, this could see play. Currently there really isn't, so I'm not really sure it's going to get there, but it's an interesting card for sure. And next up we've got Slimefoot Thallid Transplant. 2 mana 2/2, whenever a swamp or forest enters the battlefield under your control, draft a card from its spellbook. So we'll have a look at the spellbook for this as well. So, I mean, these are all pretty low impact cards, to be honest, so this definitely isn't going to see play in Historic. Again, if there's a Djinn mid-range deck, this is a threat that is going to keep generating threats as the game goes on. So maybe in a Djinn mid-range deck, maybe in the sideboard for super grindy matchups, but I'm not really sure. I think a lot of these cards just aren't really going to impact the board in a meaningful way. So even in Alchemy, I'm not really sure about this one, to be honest. Next up, we've got Teferi's Contingency. So it's white, blue, blue. Counter target spell. Each card in its controller's graveyard, hand, and library with the same name as the spell perpetually gains. This spell costs 2 more to cast. So, Historic, I think this is just too expensive. You know, outside of Archmage's Charm, I'm really not high on 3-mana counter spells in general. I think you really need to be 2 mana to be efficient enough in Historic. You know, Archmage's Charm is the exception because it's so flexible. So, I don't think this is going to see any play in Historic. In Alchemy, though, this is a pretty decent counter spell for blue-white, and the fact that it basically makes all of the copies of whatever you counter cost 2 more for the rest of the game is really nice. You know, if you manage to counter an important card like a Lae'zel or a Diviner of Fates or a Shieldred, for example, that's a really big game. So if there's a blue-white control deck, I could definitely see this being the counter spell of choice. It being blue-blue-white is potentially a drawback, though, considering the mana base in blue-white control probably isn't that great, but I guess they do have the Pain land from the latest set. But yeah, if there's a blue-white control deck in Alchemy, I could see it seeing play, but definitely not in Historic. You know, I think 3-mana counter spells in general aren't good enough. And we've got Tiana, Angelic Mechanic, 3-mana 3/2 with flying. When it or another legendary creature you control crews a vehicle, that vehicle perpetually gains +1/+0. So definitely not going to see play in Historic. It's just too underpowered. And again, in Alchemy, there's no vehicles deck. Even in a vehicles deck, the effect doesn't seem particularly exciting to me, so I just generally don't think this card's going to see play either way. Next up, we've got Vidalian Trove Mage, 3-mana 3/3 Merfolk Wizard. Whenever one or more other non-token creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, choose one of those creatures, conjure a duplicate of the chosen creature into your hand. So this card is really interesting to me because I could potentially see this seeing play in Historic Merfolk, because Merfolk in general is quite good at forcing attacks through. You know, the big drawback of cards like this is that you have to be able to force damage through, but out of all the decks in Historic, I think Merfolk is typically good at that because it has ways to tap down the opponent's creatures like Merfolk Trickster. It has ways to flash in Lords as well, so in general it's very difficult for the opponent to block all of your creatures, and there are a lot of good Merfolk that you want to get a second copy of. You know, if you can attack with a Trickster, get another copy in your hand, then you can flash that in to tap down another creature, and then it just essentially produces card advantage every single turn, which is nice. But on the flip side, if the opponent is able to block, or they have a removal spell for this, it doesn't seem as good as another Lord effect. You know, it's slower than just having an extra Lord in your deck, for example, so maybe you could play it in the sideboard against grindier matchups, potentially, but it is also kind of vulnerable to removal. I mean, I don't know, it definitely seems like an interesting card to me, and I could see it seeing play in Merfolk, but again, you're trading speed for value with this card, so, you know, again, maybe it's good in certain matchups and not as great in others, but it's definitely one that's worth trying, I think. And then in terms of Alchemy, there isn't really a Merfolk deck, but it doesn't specify it specifically has to be Merfolk. There isn't really a green-blue aggressive deck in Alchemy, though, so I don't think there's a home for it in Alchemy, but this could potentially see play in Historic. I'll be interested to see whether this one actually lands or not. I could see it going either way, to be honest. I'm not really sure on that one. And then finally, the last card in the set, Coalition Construct, 3-mana artifact creature. It's Construct, it's a 2/2, and as it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type, and it becomes the chosen type in addition to its other types. And when it enters the battlefield, other creatures you control of the chosen type and creatures cards of that type in your hand perpetually get +1/+1. So this is really interesting because it's essentially a Lord effect for any tribe, and the advantage of this card is that the buff stays even if the construct dies, which is really nice. You know, most Lord effects, if you kill the Lord, you lose the buff. The obvious downside of this though is that it doesn't buff if you draw a card and then play it, it doesn't buff that card, if that makes sense. You need to have it on the battlefield or in your hand. So in Historic, I could see this seeing play, but I think your deck either needs to really want a high density of Lords or be a tribe that doesn't have Lords anyway. So the two main homes that initially came to mind with this is, first of all, Merfolk. Merfolk is a deck, I mean, obviously it's kind of a joke how many Lords that deck has already, but if you wanted to just maximize the amount of Lords in the deck, you could just potentially run this alongside the other 4 Lords. Then you've got 5 Lords in your deck, and your board is just going to get completely huge really, really quickly. The other potential deck, like I said, is tribes that don't have a Lord already. So one that came to mind that could be nice is Shamans, for example. And the nice thing with Coalition Construct in Shamans is, because it's an Enter the Battlefield ability, it triggers twice off the Harmonic Prodigy. So if you already have a Harmonic Prodigy in play, the Coalition Construct will trigger twice. So if you're running a tribal deck like Shamans that doesn't really have a Lord, I know Rage Forger kind of acts like a Lord in a way, but if you wanted, if you're going super wide in a tribe like that, Coalition Construct could act as another Lord in those sorts of decks. Now again, I'm not really sure there's room for it in Shamans because you're already wanting to run Seasoned Pyromancer, you're already wanting to run Rage Forger, you're probably wanting to run maybe Fable of the Mirror Breaker or Cabaret Revels, but if you're just going for a full creature version and you're going really wide, you know, a deck like Shamans could appreciate this as well. And if, in general, if you're just running a tribal deck that doesn't have a good Lord effect, this could be a nice one there. In terms of Alchemy, I think this is a nice pickup for mono red goblins specifically. You know, looking at the card pool for goblins, I wasn't super excited for it, but the fact that you now get an extra Lord, you have the Goblin Influx array, and you can still run stuff like Cabaret Revels with this as well, seems like this could be playable in Alchemy, specifically to help out a deck like mono red goblins. So that's the end of it. I hope that didn't drag on for too long, but I'm really excited for this set. There's a bunch of decks that I really want to try out in Historic and Alchemy. If you think there's any applications of these cards that I've missed, definitely let me know in the comments as well, because I'm always interested to hear other people's cool ideas for brews that they've got as well. Let me know if you're excited for this set, and I'm definitely going to be trying a bunch of these cards out, and hopefully if I can come up with some good stuff in both Historic or Alchemy, I should have some new decks with these cards coming up pretty soon. So anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comments if you've got any other ideas from these cards, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Big up!